Welcome everyone to this month's webinar on the topic of directors and officers insurance, better known as D&O insurance. Now, every officer and director knows the term of D&O, but most know very little of how it works. So today's discussion will give you the details that you need to know, and I think you'll find it quite interesting in our discussion today. Quick note before we get started, for those with your Global Board Director Competency Designation certification, you'll receive 1 continuing professional education credit by attending today's webinar as well. All right, let me do a quick intro of our guest today, Charlie Stenger. Charlie is a partner at Sunstar Insurance Group, a private equity-backed insurance agency based in the Midwest. He provides risk management solutions for investors and businesses with a focus on cyber and director and officers insurance. Charlie's international experience and solutions for, Charlie's international experience and connectivity provides his clients with unique access to carriers and specialty programs around the globe. So Charlie, it's a pleasure having you here today. When I was planning on doing this webinar, you are one of the first folks, of course, that popped into my mind, and it's a pleasure knowing you and working with you over the past many years.
Absolutely, Mark. Thanks for having me. It's always a pleasure. You know, we talk frequently, of course, on this topic, and it's fun today to host a webinar here, answer some questions, and work through some fun information. You know, and for many people will know about Mark Pfister's background, but for those who don't, Mark is a governance and strategy expert, board director and board consultant, having worked with hundreds of public and private and nonprofit boards with a focus in strategy, governance, and technology cybersecurity. He is known as the board architect for his work in defining the structural components of effective boards. His book, Across the Board, the modern architecture behind an effective board of directors, is a bestseller with circulation in over 70 countries. That's awesome. Great to be
Thanks, Charlie. Appreciate it. And let's jump into it so we can give our audience exactly what they're coming here for today. And I think they'll find it quite interesting. So a couple little starter points here as reminders and frequently asked questions. So our purpose today is truly to share knowledge on the foundational indemnification and insurance elements required for robust board director liability coverage. So obviously that's why we're here today. If you have questions, please write them in the Q&A section. To make this as efficient as possible, we usually start to answer those at the end of the webinar. So we do plan on leaving some time to answer those questions. If we are not able to get to all of them at the end of the webinar, we will absolutely follow up by email with you afterwards. And also the presentation as well as the recorded video of today's webinar, you'll have access to that in another day or so. And I'll send an email directly out to you with a link of where you can find that to either review the video or also download the presentation if indeed you want it. Okay. All right, so just a quick thing what to walk away with from today's discussion. And we like to give this as kind of your pathway or your roadmap of how we're going to go about today's discussion. So we want to first start off with director liability trending and basics. So where are we at today? What's happening? Where do we feel we're going in that area? Then we want to get into the meat and potatoes of today's discussion, which is these 3 main areas of liability coverage, which starts out with indemnification, and then moving into your D&O insurance, and then the IDL, or what's called independent director liability insurance, which many are not aware of. And then we'll wrap up with a couple of important points and reminders as we go to our Q&A. So also as part of our goals, keep in mind throughout this discussion that we want you to be thinking in the realm of if there's an evaluation of a current board's coverage. So if you're currently sitting on a board, do you know the proper areas to look for in your liability coverage as a board director? And that's as a whole, collectively the overall board. Then look at it also as evaluating your own risk as a director on that board. And then thirdly, I like to think of this, if you talk about it from a board candidate's viewpoint, deciding whether or not to join a board The review of the indemnification and the D&O insurance should absolutely be a primary consideration before you say yes to a board seat, to make sure you understand what your not just professional liability, but even your personal liability will be by joining that board. And Charlie, I know you'll give a ton of information on that today, and also the understanding that many of us are not insurance experts as you are. So it's important to reach out to someone such as yourself to do these comparisons to make sure that there's no gaps between an example of indemnification as well as the D&O insurance.
I thought you were going to tell me to keep it simple so we don't get into the insurance weeds and but yes, this is going to be fun.
Yeah. You take it wherever you think it's valuable to go. So it's your show in those areas. All right. Okay. So let's start off first with director liability trendings and basics that we're seeing right now. So go ahead, Charlie, you kick off.
Right. There's the director liability and trending basics right now are that this is an ongoing problem. It's not new, but the claims that are being brought are higher than ever. So it's, from a historical standpoint, it's the worst time ever to be a director and officer getting sued. And we need to make sure that we have protection for our directors and officers, that go beyond corporate indemnification. And, we'll discuss a couple of these types of lawsuits throughout our discussion here today.
Great. Great. I like to also, from your point here about these types of lawsuits are amazingly messy and expensive. I've seen this firsthand with many of the clients I work with, and they truly are messy, they're expensive, and they seem to always last an extremely long amount of time.
Oh yeah, I read about one recently we might talk about later. It had a $22 million legal bill. Wow. The expenses on the legal team were over $500,000. So you can see how these things can get out of control expensive in a hurry.
Absolutely. Another interesting bit of information in the trending and statistics area, in an article I did with the same exact name about a year ago as compared to the name that I'm using for this webinar, do you do the D&O? I did this poll on LinkedIn and other areas where I reached out to a group of directors that I know personally. And when I asked them the question, when being considered for a board role, do you thoroughly review and weigh the robustness of the provided director and officer's insurance in your decision? And, a pretty resounding 92% came back and said yes, only 8% said no, which, to me, even that there was any percentage of no coming back on that shows a fundamental misunderstanding of the importance of that coverage. But when I dug a little bit further into this question and asked about their understanding of D&O insurance, and you're not hearing the correlation back to indemnification and the possibility of IDL or independent director liability insurance, areas, Charlie, that you'll talk about shortly, it was clear to me that the buzzword of D&O insurance is well known, but the actual components, coverage, how it works, and the integration of those areas is very misunderstood right now. And I think part of the reason that we talked about doing this webinar to shed some light in those areas.
I'll tell you, without sounding like a commercial for you, I think that that's where you drive a lot of value for your clients and people that are, going to have a conversation with you, is that you'll try to dig into the details of, how a program may or may not be structured for their consideration. Because, you've handed me off several referrals over the years where people said, hey, I need to understand what is covered and what is not covered, and what is it, what I have on the line of exposure. So, the fact that you're helping people identify that, I think, is a true value to your clients.
Great, thank you. All right, so let's talk a little more about the trending we're seeing out there. So I get different reports throughout the year, each year, on what we're seeing in the trending space of D&O. So 2020 as an example, and some of the data just came out recently on the close of 2020. And it's, obviously you have to wait for the year to close, and then the data starts being processed for that. But some interesting things to see here. If we do a 4-year trending starting in 2017 to 2020, 2020 saw a big increase in the underwriters' views of the board's role when it comes to risk. This is significant because you'll see, even if you look back prior to 2017, normally you'll see the CEO as the highest view of risk when it comes to the organization. And maybe that increases even more, I should say, when you include the whole C-suite and other officer level type positions in an organization. But we're seeing now with the increasing importance, regulation, and responsibility areas for the board of directors, that actually has a direct correlation also to the board's view of being part of the risk element of an organization. So when this question of who is the most critical person or group at a company when you think about mitigating D&O risk, the board's risk, to your point earlier, Charlie, that it's becoming more difficult to be a director that's fully protected in all areas. It is going to be a challenge, and I think we're going to see an increase of the board being viewed as one of those major risk components. To me, in my world, I'm happy to see that because I think the board needs to take a more active role, but they also need to be sure that they are covering their liability areas properly and effectively throughout the process.
That's right. You know, moving into some securities class action events that happened, you know, just recently, right? You know, Mark, you were saying some of the numbers that we have coming out for 2020 are staggering. Obviously, you have some events like Norwegian cruise lines, which, you know, for those of us who may or may not remember, you know, going back to last March or April when some false claims were made about, you know, their policies and processes around these types of activities, they ended up with a huge problem on their hands. Not to mention some of these other organizations that we see here. So we feel that the problems from 2020 are going to bleed into 2021. As we're seeing, there was a high intensity of claims from about March through May, and then they backed off a little bit, but we're starting to see a resurgence of that again.
And it's interesting, you know, it's unfortunate that it takes an event the size and the scope, I'll say, of COVID-19 or this overall pandemic to bring some of these, what I view as foundational issues in a board and an organization to the surface. But usually you have these watershed type of moments when you have a global type incident or challenge such as COVID-19.
That's right. You know, when the stress test occurs, that's usually when you see the massive holes in coverage, or, you know, companies just not having the right procedures in place. We touched on this a little bit, you know, consistent increases. A lot of our, you know, clients are not happy with this graph. You know, fortunately or unfortunately, you're not alone. If you're having to pay more for your D&O coverage, one of our public companies that we were dealing with earlier this year, in 2020, saw a massive increase, you know, 90% increase in their D&O. And, you know, it's just, it's gut wrenching for companies to get these types of increases, especially when they know that they still need the coverage. And one, I think, interesting aspect on this slide, if you look at in the bottom right-hand corner, 93% of respondents saw a rate increase. No one saw a decrease. Huge bit of information. Unfortunately, we don't see that slowing down. One thing that you might consider asking your insurance advisor on something like this is to say, hey, put me on a fee. Put me on a flat fee. I don't think it's fair that you deliver me a 50% rate increase and now your commissions just went up by 50%. So you can mitigate that by putting them on a flat fee.
Interesting. Thank you. All right. And, you know, as we start to drill down, and you probably see we're starting at the very topmost area of trending and the basics, and then we'll drill down into the actual components of proper liability coverage for directors and officers. But let me first say in this, and this should be common sense, I'll say to start with, but something we may overlook. Your first line of protection really starts with you. You're in full control of these areas. So making sure you're joining ethical and values-based organizations and boards. You have the ability to decipher if a board you're going to join is of that background and of that ilk. Fully understand the offered indemnification and liability coverage. We're going to speak in a moment about what to look for in those areas, and of course the integration of how those things work in a serial type manner. And then evaluate the need for supplemental liability coverage. So above and beyond the indemnification of an organization and the D&O insurance, you have the ability of another weapon on your tool belt, I'll say. And Charlie, you'll talk about that shortly when it comes to the IDL areas, either as a group of additional insurance for the overall board, or you as a board director individually actually getting that coverage as an additional layer of protection. And I know we're going to get into that shortly as we drill down a little bit further.
Absolutely.
All right. So something I thought, or we thought would be helpful in kind of getting the first view of how we're going to talk about this today, because there are some complications here. We want to try to simplify this as much as possible. So I like to think of this in my layman's view of the understanding the order of this coverage. So think about this first and foremost as corporate indemnification is commonly the area that you are covered first as an officer or a director. Then it moves into, if you're not covered in that area, commonly the D&O insurance will kick in next. There are some nuances, Charlie, so I know you're going to talk about one of those. And then think about it as your third step of coverage or liability coverage is your IDL, your independent director liability insurance. I find it extremely helpful for me, even in guiding some of my clients and the boards I work with, in thinking about this in this very serial way, to know that first and foremost, you want to make sure that the organization you're going to join the board for, the current board you're sitting on, the indemnification is commonly what protects you first and foremost. And then the D&O in many cases makes up the gaps in those areas or offers up additional coverage. So I know we'll talk about that. Many officers and directors don't understand that D&O kicks in where indemnification leaves off. And again, I like to think of these, and it may be helpful to our audience today, that the coverages can be viewed as serial, meaning in an order rather than parallel. Another major misunderstanding of directors, they think that the D&O kicks in first, and that is actually rarely the case. It's the indemnification that is there to protect you first and foremost.
Absolutely.
Indemnification claimed by the organization that you're working with or for.
You have to be indemnified by the organization. That's what you need.
Absolutely.
That's step one.
Okay. All right, so we've done this first overview. We know the common or most prevalent order of the insurances and the coverage areas. Let's start to drill into these. Let's start off with the director and officer indemnification. And Charlie, I know you're going to talk about where that starts, what it looks like, and some of the main points of that. So let's do that now.
So as mentioned, it's the first line of a director's liability protection, and you're going to find this in the articles of incorporation or the bylaws. So, Mark, you're more profound when you explain this, but you can't get lazy on this part of the equation. You have to ask for the articles of incorporation. You have to really get into the weeds of what these details are. We've seen it time and time again where a director, maybe on a nonprofit, is asked to be on the board for a particular reason, and they're not getting the proper indemnification. So we need to make sure that we are taking a look at this first and foremost as we are going through the process.
And it's really the organization itself, the company, that is responsible for the level of indemnification that they provide. And really, from my viewpoint, Charlie, and sorry to dumb this down, but I'm going to do it from my layman's terms viewpoint, which is the organization itself is the one that is putting out the funding and offering the protection first and foremost for the officers and directors. And that's what's included as part of those indemnification statements. The other thing I personally look for in this is that if there's not a lot of detail in the articles of incorporation or the bylaws on the indemnification for the officers or directors, I immediately look for a common separate document, or it's a separately written indemnification provision that gives a lot more detail on it. Now, the third component of this is that if you can't find it in the organization's articles of incorporation or the bylaws, and you don't have or you can't get your hands on a separately written indemnification provision, you already know that you're going to be at likely significant risk in that organization if the organization itself is not indemnifying you properly. Now, the next step on that would be when we roll in a moment, Charlie, to D&O insurance, because it may be the D&O insurance covers some of those gaps. But I like to think that the indemnification being your first line of protection, you want to make sure that that is done properly and the organization understands that they are responsible for covering you in that space.
That's right. Well said.
All right. So, just as a summary of the indemnification area, a board director, whether it's a seated board member or a board candidate, should pay very close attention to the organization's solvency, making sure that even if they claim certain levels of indemnification, they can back that up. They have the actual funding and the liquidity in the organization to actually pay for those things, such as your defense or the attorneys you need or representing you properly in that space, should the need, hopefully the need doesn't arise, but if it does. And also, if an organization's articles of incorporation or bylaws don't provide enough written detail, again, you want to look for that separately written document to see if there is more detail on that. And then you can weigh that into your decisioning of whether or not to join that board, or if you're already on that board, if you plan on getting your additional levels of coverage, even yourself personally, which Charlie, I know you'll talk about that when we get to the IDL area. So first area, indemnification, clearly on the onus of the organization to claim what they're going to cover, how they're going to cover it, and what the details are of that liability coverage for you as an officer or director. First line of defense for you. Then we move into the director and officer insurance. And this, Charlie, again, I think is an area of your deep expertise. And let's go into that now.
So D&O insurance, the director and officer coverage, is your second line of liability protection. And where are we going to find this? It's going to be a standalone policy or document issued by an insurance carrier. Many of you have dealt with this, so that's going to be common for you to understand. But for those of you who don't know, this is not covered under a GL policy or a property policy or anything like that. It's got its own director and officer insurance policy. This is when is this going to kick in? This is going to kick in when the company is unable to honor its indemnification obligations due to a number of reasons. And there are situations where organizations are going to leverage the D&O insurance to provide an outlet for reimbursement when they do not specifically indemnify their directors and officers. There are three types of things you want to consider. We call them the ABCs of D&O. Your side A, B, and C coverage each cover a different type of thing. So to start with side B first, we think B, balance sheet, right? That's when that coverage is going to kick in when a company's indemnification obligations need to be met. It's going to reimburse the balance sheet. And then C, sometimes the corporation is sued, the entity is sued itself. So that's when the side C is going to kick in. But the side A is really where you want to think about this for yourself. If you are a director or an officer, that's what's going to protect you. That is what's going to help provide the coverage that you need when there is a problem and the company's getting sued. You're gonna rely on that side A coverage.
Great, thank you, Charlie. And actually, maybe we touch on a few of the areas. I'm always keen on searching out the exclusions, and I think the insurance world has become quite great writers when it comes to things that they exclude and the terminology they use. So,
I know.
We've listed 6 here. Maybe you want to choose the 2 with the check marks there to talk about for a moment. But our audience should know that these are really some of the main areas you want to understand if these are the exclusions listed in your policy.
That's right. If you think that your company is participating in something fraudulent, an insurance carrier is going to pull off that D&O policy because they'll say, hey, we're not going to cover fraud. If you guys get sued because you guys were doing, having a huge problem with fraud, that's not on them. And then a derivative shareholder action carve-back is interesting because the shareholders can bring an action against the board. And that's a huge issue. And I think we should talk about that in more detail if we have a little bit of time at the end. We can talk about a couple of examples. But these and one other quick one on insured versus insured. What does that mean? People get confused here. If one board member sues another board member, that's not going to be covered by the carrier. Why? Well, they don't want to get involved in some sort of internal corporate litigation. So those are some things to consider.
Charlie, let me just throw 2 things in there as questions for you. So one is, if a board director sues a fellow board director or the remaining board, right? Is that something that commonly would be listed if it's not in the D&O? Would that be under the indemnification clause?
It could be under the indemnification clause. That is very likely to be a place that you want to check. I think from an insurance perspective, we get the question of, is that covered? Is my D&O going to cover that? And that's when we would say unlikely.
Gotcha. And when it comes to the word derivative, and I'll ask the question for the benefit of the audience, can you just explain that very quickly? Because that's a very common word when we talk about D&O insurance.
Sure. Shareholders, right? Where that's what you're going to think of when you think of a derivative.
Understood. Okay, great. So as a summary for the D&O insurance area, again, to avoid conflicts or coverage gaps, be sure to look for 100%, and I can't see my screen here with the pictures there. There we go, 100% defense cost allocation clause. This is one, Charlie, I've seen actually catch a lot of directors off guard when this is not stipulated in the D&O insurance. And what happens is the organization or they themselves personally, in some cases, are expected to outlay first and foremost the cost of their defense and then be reimbursed later. And that obviously, for some of the amounts we're talking about here, that doesn't obviously make sense if you're taking on that risk to be a board director. I want to also point out that when we talk about wrongdoing of a board and the liability of the D&O insurance, that drops off. They won't protect you from that. It again comes back to making sure that you're joining ethical groups of people, whether it be a board of directors, a C-level, or the overall organization itself. So look for that 100% defense cost allocation clause. And also, go ahead, Charlie, sorry.
I think that's a good point that, you're clarifying here.
Great. And then also pay close attention to any defense cost exclusions, as I started to mention, as D&O suits commonly exclude extensive allegations. So, what I've noticed with these policies, Charlie, is that they're very clear but very siloed also. So when you start to get to areas where there's a lot of integrative points of liability, many of these insurance carriers start to back away from those areas or spend more time in their due diligence to try to break these down into very siloed type of vertical areas that they can study and dig into. So just know, go ahead, sorry.
Well, one of my mentors in the insurance business said that most people focus on the wrong thing with an insurance policy, and they focus on the dollar amount. And they say there's this long policy, and the only thing they care about is how much it costs, where the real money is made or lost are on those words in the exclusion. So you got to look at each policy. They're not all created equal. So we've got to understand what that policy is actually covering for you and what it doesn't cover.
That's great. And it's a great segue from that. So into the IDL, the independent director liability insurance, because again, if there's a gap in some way in your individual director coverage, right, whether it be through indemnification or in D&O or both, what happens next in that? And there's really what I like to view as a third line of protection in that space, which is the IDL.
Yes.
So let's jump into that for a moment. So remember our path again. We went from indemnification offered by the organization, the D&O that's commonly offered collectively to the board and other officers of the organization, including the C-suite. And then the third level, or what I like to view as the third level of coverage in this, is the IDL insurance.
And the IDL insurance, to pick up here, many people may have never heard about this, but it's used because you're going to have a standalone policy issued by the insurance carrier. Okay. And this is going to protect you above and beyond the indemnification that the corporation is going to provide. It's going to go above and beyond the corporation's current D&O policy. Now, the question is, why the heck would I want or need one if there's a D&O policy in place? But we just mentioned they might not have a robust policy. And you might be joining a board that says, you're joining a board that might not understand the importance of this as well as somebody like Mark does or Mark's clients. So, and this happens, Mark, you sent me somebody recently and we said, okay, you're being offered this board seat. They don't have a good D&O policy. You're scared. How much is it going to cost for us to get an IDL policy, which you feel comfortable with, so that it protects your personal balance sheet and you can still fulfill your board duties? How much is that going to cost? Okay, let's negotiate that into the offer. right? So now you can cover yourself, and you can, frankly, you're doing your client or your corporation justice right out of the gate by explaining it to them how important D&O insurance is. In fact, you're not going to take the gig unless you have the proper coverage, because you and I both know somebody that worked in the it wasn't the liquor, but it was a food and beverage business, and they ended up getting sued. The board was it was kind of a nothing job for them, and they ended up taking a huge, massive hit to their balance sheet, and they say, I'll never sit on another board again.
Yeah.
But this coverage would have helped him in that particular instance.
Yeah, and I'll say, Charlie, to add to some of your points there, I used to be very black and white when it came to, if the indemnification and the D&O was, number one, lacking or had gaps, would you still say yes or no to the board seat? And my answer was always run as fast as you can away from that opportunity. But now with this IDL insurance, which I think has become more robust in recent years as well, due to some of those gaps that are known between the indemnification and the D&O policies, I kind of preface that with super important indemnification and D&O insurance, but know that it's not necessarily a no and a cutoff right at that point for a potential yes to a board seat, because you can make up some of those gaps or all of those gaps with a proper IDL policy, as you mentioned, for that extra level of protection. What's interesting with this too, especially in the US in the last 5 to 10 years, there's been certain legislation that has actually made it easier to, what they say, pierce the corporate veil, right? We've seen that at all different levels. The board was probably one of the last holdouts, I'll say, in that area, where they were, for the most part, very protected for a long time. But now we'll see that they are losing some of that protection. It's not just assumed that they're covered, or they're assumed that what they did was right. So the personal liability that plays into this now can be extreme. I'm getting to the point now, Charlie, in my world, in the coaching work that I do, to say that the IDL should be looked at regardless of the robustness of the indemnification and the D&O. And that's not a sales point for you. It really is just saying that the liability is growing greatly. The number of cases are growing. Derivative type cases are growing. You need to protect yourself in this realm, or you're absolutely right. It's the role is not worth the risk in some cases without that protection.
That's right.
So, and one other thing to mention, or two other things to mention here. So, independent directors, they can seek this additional liability insurance for themselves above and beyond the D&O and obviously the indemnification. But know that there's a couple ways to look at this. And Charlie, weigh in on this as well as needed. But the way I recommend the IDL is in 3 different ways, really. One is it could be a supplemental coverage for a single director sitting on one board. So they will go out and get it personally. Maybe they're reimbursed, maybe they're not, but they know that they want to have that coverage for themselves above and beyond what's offered collectively between indemnification and the D&O policy. Secondly, supplemental coverage in the form of IDL insurance can also be for a single director as an umbrella across multiple boards. So let's say that I have IDL insurance and I sit on 3 public boards. I can actually get a policy that covers me for all of my board work, not just for one organization, but across 3 organizations, as an example. Another great way to indemnify yourself.
And without getting too insurance technical, we have to be careful with the word umbrella when we use that word, because
Thank you.
That word sometimes is misconstrued, because umbrellas typically insinuate blanket coverage. And as you and I both know, these are going to be very specific. And, there's more likely underwriting at each level, right? You wouldn't just have a policy that would say, yeah, any board you sit on. But to your point, you could have multiple boards with underneath IDLs if you sit on several boards. Yes.
Great point. Thanks for clarifying that as well. And then the third area for IDL can be viewed as supplemental coverage for an entire board. So if your board is made up of 8 people or 10 people, whatever the number is, you have a certain level of indemnification through the organization. You have a certain level of D&O coverage. But if gaps are viewed in those areas, or if the board is just a little skittish and wants to have a little more coverage, they can also purchase the IDL as a, and I was going to use the word umbrella, but I'm not going to, Charlie, but it can be viewed as a supplemental or additional coverage for the entire board of that organization. So
Yep.
I can't recommend the IDL area enough, and I think it's going to become more commonplace and more mainstream, quite frankly, as we come into some of the upcoming years, and definitely across the next decade, we're going to see this become commonplace.
And some of your clients might see on this last bullet point for the entire board, if you're trying to come up with this, what you'll see in that case probably would be that side A difference in coverage, DIC, and that's when a policy is going to get a more robust policy for your side A coverage for your board members. So sometimes you will actually see the board force a company to get a broader program for everybody to cover everybody at once.
Understood. Understood. Great. Thank you, Charlie. All right, so let's do a couple of points and reminders on this. I know we've only scratched the surface and touched the very high level of this. Charlie, I know that for you, with all of your deep knowledge in this space, there's a lot of details to this, which brings me back to the point that somebody, a director or an officer, needs to have some other expert look at this as a backup to what they've learned today, of course, and understand this from a fully integrated viewpoint as well, which an expert will bring to the table. So a few things to remember this before we get to the Q&A. Indemnification and D&O insurance increases in an organization's ability to attract and retain strong leaders. So this is absolutely true. I can tell you that in the board director space, for savvy board directors, one of the earliest questions they're going to ask is going to be, what is the coverage in the indemnification and the liability insurances that you offer for this position? And that is not only going to attract the right type of directors to a board, but it's also going to keep them. You don't want them looking over their shoulder every time there's a board meeting or every month because they're worried about the coverage of the liability that they have on that particular board.
That's right. I think here, if we look at the middle bullet point here, we need to think about corporate indemnification, what the D&O policy has listed in it. Do I need an IDL policy for myself? How do I eliminate risk from my personal balance sheet? That's what this whole series is about.
Absolutely. And Charlie, I'm going to ask you the question that I'm commonly put on the spot with as well, which is, even with all three of these areas of coverage or indemnification, or the combination of them, do we ever think we're going to get to the point where we are eliminating or lowering our risk as a board director? Where would you put that line, I'll say, in those, if we had to measure this in some way?
They said that the Titanic was unsinkable. So, right. I think that you can't ever completely eliminate risk. And what one of my other insurance mentors said, we can sell you more insurance than you can probably buy. So you can't eliminate all risks, but if you can reduce your risks dramatically and try to pinpoint your risks and understand where they are, that is critical. The discussion points that you had in the beginning of not joining a corporate board that doesn't participate in good behavior, that's step one. If you made that mistake and you joined a board that might not be acting appropriately, that's when you've really opened yourself up to a tremendous amount of risk.
Absolutely. Thank you. Thirdly, on this page, take care in comparing what is covered in the corporate indemnification clauses along with the D&O insurance to ensure there are no gaps between the two. Again, we scratched the surface on this today. At the very least, I hope that you're walking away with the understanding that there is a connection and integration between those two in a specific order. And for most directors, if they're not coming from the insurance and specifically the D&O insurance vertical, you're going to need to get help in the review of that to fully understand your risk and the level of risk you're willing to take on, and if that's going to require you or push you in the route of getting that additional IDL coverage to cover any of those gaps and still be able to say yes to the seat.
That's right. Yeah, I think many misconceptions that nonprofit directors and trustees have negligible legal exposure within these entities, and that's not the case. We were touching on it before, but if, what we see often with nonprofit boards is many times it's the largest donor or donors that are asked to be on the board. They have a natural inclination or soft spot in their heart for this particular board and this particular nonprofit, and so they look beyond some of the things that maybe they would otherwise have have gotten into the weeds on. And unfortunately, that is not a good defense. So don't let your heart get in the way of your balance sheet.
Yeah, I truly see this firsthand also, Charlie, in that it's extremely rare to see a nonprofit board director, number one, understand the things we spoke about today, or number two, know that they actually require, because they're in a fiduciary voting position of that organization, listed as a board member and an officer, that they have liability. And it's also considered to be not just professional, but personal liability to them. I write about this in depth in my book. That's this has been the problem for many directors, even that started out in the public and private space, and then wanted to take on a nonprofit board and just to give back at the end towards the end of their career, and all of a sudden they're dealing with all these legal obligations that they never could have even considered working for a public or a private organization. So hugely important. It's not known. Most people are not aware of this level of liability in the nonprofit area.
That's right, and we're not, Mark, you and I are not ones to say don't do that. Don't ever get involved with a nonprofit board and give back. We're just trying to say, let's identify where the risks are and cover them appropriately.
Absolutely right. And then in closing, before we just do a couple of final points and then get to some of the Q&A, remember that one of the biggest takeaways for today is understanding you have to do your homework in researching and validating liability coverage, and you're ensuring your initial elation of joining a board is not overshadowed by personal exposure to risk. And know that that risk is not just reputational risk, that truly is personal financial liability. So if there's ever multiple components that should scare somebody, when you mention reputation and personal financial liability, there's really not much more that could scare, I think, somebody to making sure that they are even seeking the advice of a professional to make sure they understand these things. And as I mentioned earlier, also, Charlie, we know that a lot of the verbiage and the way things are written in many of these policies, any insurance policy, it really takes an expert to understand what some of those clauses mean and certain insurance jargon, I'll say. Sorry to put that on you, but you have a lot of that in your world.
we have a team that reviews this. It's not just one person, because we put our heads together and try to come up with the best plan and make sure that several people are taking a look at this. And you're right, it's complex and it takes a definite a level of understanding, likely the industry that the company is in, as well as the policy that they're getting.
Great, thank you. All right, so just before we get to Q&A, I welcome you to visit our website for Pfister Strategy on my side of the discussion today. Speaking, consulting and advisory, coaching certification, you can see it all on there. Even the listing of upcoming webinars and past webinar recordings. Go ahead, Charlie.
Well, your slide is much fancier than mine, Mark, but you're fancier than me, so that's good. Charlie Stanger, insurance advisor, Sunstar Insurance Group. We're a private equity-backed organization. We've got about 25 offices throughout the Midwest. We place about $500 million of premium every year on behalf of our clients. We're growing. We love selling insurance. We love helping our clients. Give me a call if you need anything.
I am going to point out you have umbrellas on your slide, though, Charlie.
Well, that is a very good point. This is from Denmark. This is from a market in Denmark. And I just kind of, it's not traveler's insurance, but it certainly does represent insurance, I hope.
I had to say it.
I know.
All right. So a couple of things here. If you'd like a copy of today's presentation, send me an email, but know that in the next day or so, as I mentioned, the video and the actual presentation will be up to a link on a website, which I'll email to you. I welcome you to pick up a copy of my book where I touch on areas of D&O as well as all architecture on boards. And I welcome you to connect with both of us, Charlie and myself, on LinkedIn. And also, if you're interested in monthly updates on different board topics, please sign up for my newsletter as well. Let's go to some of our questions, Charlie. Let me see what we got here. I'm not sure that everybody can see my screen, but I got a few here that we'll start out with. Board seats are becoming a very competitive area with many candidates vying for board seats. Are you seeing those that the question, the D&O, what does it say here? Are you seeing those that the question of D&O coverage lose out on coveted roles? Absolutely. And this is on, I would tell you that the liability, as we're stating, is becoming so great in the board director realm that it absolutely has to be one of the vetting points for you as a board director today. So I go back to that comment of that initial flattery and elation of being offered a board seat of any entity type, public, private, or nonprofit. This has to be a consideration for you, and to even understand your level of risk that you're willing to take on. And if you require an IDL policy, even if the organization doesn't offer, some nonprofits don't mention anything about indemnification and they don't have D&O. So that means it's you personally in that space. And we know coming up from the nonprofit areas into private and public areas, we know that obviously it's a combination of the D&O and the indemnification, and then you decide on the IDL if you think that that can cover your gaps. But I'm a prime example of this, and I've had 9 board seats offered to me in the last 18 months. And I want to say of the 9, I think 7 of them were public companies. 3 of them had terrible D&O and indemnification policies. And I asked the questions as part of my process of going through their nominating committee vetting process, and it pointed out huge gaps to even those board directors in the nominating committee. They were not aware of it.
Wow,
So
that always blows my mind that public companies struggle with this, but I see it all the time on D&O, cyber, different types of policies that you would think would be buttoned up, and for some reason they're not. And I think that it's perhaps a level of understanding. There might be an educational component to this, and then sometimes it's making sure that you have the right advisors that are structuring the programs correctly.
Yeah, and just further to Bonnie's question here, where she's looking at it from the other side, where it says, are you seeing those that question the D&O coverage lose out on coveted roles? So I almost view that as if the person is being a pain in the butt by asking too many details on the D&O or the indemnification policy, is the board viewing that as too pushy or trying to get too much out of this organization by asking for that? I don't know that I've seen it that way, but then again, I don't think many nominating committees or those making the decision on the board would actually state it in that way. But regardless of who makes that decision, that board may be doing you a favor if you're asking those questions and they think that you're a pain in the butt because you're asking those questions. I can tell you, you've probably already figured out the culture of that board, and it's probably not.
That's right. You're doing them a favor if you're asking these questions. You're already being a good board member. You're identifying gaps in their own board, your future colleagues' coverage. Right.
Governance 101 right there, I think is really what that fits into. Yeah.
That's exactly right. So if they can't get their arms around a simple question of, hey, we need to get the D&O right. Well, what else is wrong over here? And why, why do we need to, and maybe you push back and they say, this guy's, being a jerk or, Payne, we should go somewhere else. However, they might say, wow, we need to relook at how we're doing this. And, give us a couple of months and we'll come back to you with a more appropriate offer. So, you'll be surprised. I think that many of your clients are some of the more successful people, right? They're, successful business folks. And if you get to that point and you further that point by looking at the details and paying attention to those details and not looking past them.
Yeah, and the last point on this, probably a million different comments we could come up with on this, but it also makes me think about if I ask a question, which is an expectation of once I would be on a board, right? If I'm a candidate or vying for a spot on a board, and they view the question as combative or too pushy, I would immediately question their emotional intelligence, right? Which is one of the biggest pieces to the behavioral predispositions of the architecture of a board, is making sure that someone that's receiving a question or constructive criticism is not viewing that personally as an attack or criticism. They're viewing it as furthering the discussion. So there's many areas there where I think that those indicators are available. If you're probing in the D&O and the indemnification area and you're seemingly getting pushback on that, or you weren't considered for the position, they may have done you a favor.
Great.
All right, a few other questions here. Are directors commonly aware of IDL insurance? I can take that one quickly. My answer to that is rarely. And you know, when I go from my realm in the past of saying if the indemnification and D&O don't match up, or there's gaps in that, or it's just not the level of coverage, walk from the opportunity. I have that little area now where I say there's one other piece to look at in this, that we can see if these cover your gap areas, and allow you to say yes to the position without increasing your personal liability.
Yeah, well said.
All right. Here's an interesting one. This one may be a repeat. Do you see many independent directors, non-executive directors purchasing? So this may be a question for you. So on my side, Charlie, I don't see many directors asking about it nor considering the IDL area as of yet. Some are aware, but it's a very small percentage. On your side, the question is, do you see many independent directors or non-executive directors purchasing IDL insurance? So do you see that on your side?
It is not a common request. And I think because of an educational component, I think most people don't know that it exists. We have to usually educate people. You know, when somebody like you refers me a board member, you know, we'll say, hey, have you considered this?
Gotcha. Okay. Hopefully this is answering everybody's questions here. And this, excuse me, this one is definitely one for you as well, Charlie. Knowing that you are an expert in the D&O and the cybersecurity insurance space, the question is, how does cybersecurity tie into D&O and director liability?
Great question. That is about as correlated as anything right now. It doesn't really matter what firm you're with, but it's certainly if you're with a financial services firm, you have to act as a fiduciary for your clients' data, and failure to do so will result in a bad outcome. Target's a great example. You know, they had a huge hack a few years ago, and the board ended up knowing about the hack. They didn't follow the right policies and procedures. They made a lot of errors along the way, and many of them were removed.
Excellent, thank you. I think that cybersecurity area, and you know, some of the policies I've seen have specifically called out cybersecurity or even data risk type areas. I'm assuming we're going to see more of that in the next decade as well, of how specifically that's called out. And maybe not necessarily in a way that helps the person being covered, right? So it may put more of the liability on the organization, the board, and the C-level to make sure that their data policies and their cybersecurity aspects are in line with the expectation of the carrier. That's
absolutely a question. How do you handle your data? How does your IT department handle this? How many how many records do you have? What types of records are they? Right? So a financial services company is 30 times more likely to get attacked than the average business. A manufacturing business is much more likely to get attacked than the average business. Well, why? Well, you know, that's where the money is on the financial services side. That's simple. On the manufacturing side, you know, if you have a big plant that's building widgets and somebody comes in and halts production and says, give me a $10 million ransom, what are you going to do? And how long can you stay offline before it's costing you millions and millions of dollars, right? So one of my prospects last year got pegged. They ended up getting a $10 million ransom. I talked to them just the other day, and they said it was horrific. You know, little manufacturing business, and all of a sudden their systems were overtaken, and they had to pay $10 million of Bitcoin ransom.
Wow.
And I said, so what'd you do? And he said, we paid it. Or in other words, our insurance carrier paid it.
Mm-hmm.
So this stuff is going on. You know, Bitcoin is a topic for another day, but the advent of Bitcoin has made ransomware attacks more prevalent because of the autonomous nature of Bitcoin. So, you know, before you had to go in and, you know, stick a gun in a teller's face to get the money. Now you can take over the systems, get the Bitcoin wired to you and, you know, wherever, and, you know, go about your business. So I see this problem persisting. I see our use of digitization and putting more and more things into, you know, technology. That's why I've really positioned myself to become a cyber expert and understand it.
Excellent. And that ransomware, I think, is probably a big component of why we're seeing these steady increases on a yearly basis of the premiums of having D&O insurance above and beyond the indemnification, of course, the organization offers.
That's right. And cyber incident claims last year went from 1.2 to 1.9 billion. That's a 50% increase, and that's significant. So that means that they're going to have to increase the insurance premiums to make up for those losses.
Great. Well, Charlie, I thank you for your time today. I'm hoping we answered everybody's questions. If you have any additional questions, please feel free to reach out to us. You will have our contact information shortly. I will email everybody on this webinar within the next day or two with a link to the webinar, as I mentioned, as well as the file. And please feel free to reach out for whatever you need. Charlie, thank you very much. It's been a pleasure, and I hope our audience got some value out of our discussion today. Thank you, everybody.
Mark, likewise, thank you, and thank you to all that listened. Appreciate it.
Bye now.